Picture, if you will, a night 50,000 years ago. A small band of humans huddles around a fire, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Above them, the stars wheel in patterns their ancestors recognized, patterns that marked the seasons, guided their journeys, told them when to plant and when to harvest. But these early humans did something extraordinary, something that would change the course of our entire species. They began to ask why. Why does the sun rise? Why do the rains come and go? Why do we die? And in asking these questions, they stumbled upon perhaps the most powerful technology our species has ever invented. Not the wheel, not agriculture, not even writing. No, they invented belief systems that could organize strangers into societies, coordinate massive projects, and bind together thousands, then millions, then billions of people across time and space. Consider for a moment what it takes to build a city. Not just the physical labor, the cutting of stone, the hauling of materials, the careful planning of streets and buildings. No, before any of that can happen, you need something far more complex. You need thousands of people who have never met to agree on fundamental questions. Who is in charge? Why should anyone follow rules? How do we divide resources? What happens if someone breaks our agreements? For most of human history, we lived in bands of perhaps 50 to 150 individuals, small enough that everyone knew everyone else. Trust came naturally. You shared food with your cousin. You followed the lead of the respected elder. You avenged wrongs against your sister. But cities required something unprecedented: cooperation among strangers. And here, religion provided an answer so elegant, so powerful, that it would shape civilizations for millennia to come. The gods are watching. In southern Mesopotamia, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something remarkable began to unfold around 5,002 years ago. Small villages were growing into cities. Uruk, Eridu, places where tens of thousands of people lived side by side. And at the heart of each city stood a ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, and within it lived the servants of the gods, the priests. These priests were the world's first true bureaucrats. They claimed to speak for the deities, to interpret divine will, to mediate between heaven and earth. And because they spoke for the gods, they wielded extraordinary power. When the annual floods came and farmers brought their surplus grain for storage, it was the priests who recorded each contribution on clay tablets. When disputes arose over land or water rights, it was the priests who pronounced judgment. When vast labor projects needed organizing new temples, irrigation canals, or defensive walls, it was the priests who called the people to work. The temple wasn't merely a place of worship. It was a warehouse, a bank, a court of law, and a government office all combined. The priests managed vast estates, controlled trade networks, employed artisans and laborers. They collected what we might recognize as the world's first taxes, redistributed resources during lean times, and maintained the complex web of debts and obligations that held society together. They invented writing not to record prayers, but to track goods and labor. Those first written documents weren't poetry or philosophy. They were receipts, accounting ledgers, records of who owed what to whom and to the gods. But here's what made the system so brilliant. The priests weren't just managers. They were intermediaries with the divine. When they demanded grain or labor, they weren't acting on their own authority, they were fulfilling the will of the gods. This distinction changed everything. Refuse the priest, and you weren't just defying another human being, you were defying cosmic order itself. You risked divine wrath, crop failures, floods, military defeat. The punishment wouldn't just come from earthly authorities, it would come from powers beyond human control. This was revolutionary. For the first time, authority didn't depend primarily on physical strength or family lineage. It depended on claiming a connection to forces greater than any individual, and if you could make people believe that connection was real through ritual, through prophecy, through apparent miracles, you could coordinate human behavior on an unprecedented scale. Travel north to Egypt and witness this principle refined to its ultimate expression. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the land along the Nile unified under rulers who claimed not merely to speak for the gods, but to be divine themselves. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, the living god, the bridge between mortal and immortal worlds. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was the foundation of the entire political system. When Pharaoh Khufu commanded the construction of his pyramid, a tomb that would take 20 years to complete and require the labor of tens of thousands of workers, he wasn't making a request, he was enacting divine will. The Great Pyramid at Giza stands 146 meters tall, constructed from 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Moving those blocks from quarries, shaping them with copper tools, raising them into place with ramps and levers, positioning them with astonishing precision, this required a level of organization and coordination that staggers the imagination. How do you motivate such effort? How do you convince workers to spend years, decades even, laboring on a single structure? Certainly coercion played a role, but recent evidence suggests something more complex. Many workers came willingly during the agricultural off-season, fed by the state, believing their labor served a cosmic purpose. They weren't just building a tomb, they were ensuring the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife, which in turn ensured the continued prosperity of Egypt itself. The king's immortality was bound to the nation's survival. In serving the divine king, they served themselves. The priests and nobles who surrounded the pharaoh formed a hierarchy as rigid as the stones themselves. At the top, the divine ruler. Below, the high priests who performed essential rituals, then the scribes who recorded and transmitted knowledge, the nobles who administered territories, the craftsmen who created beauty and function, the farmers who produced food, and at the bottom, the laborers who provided muscle. Each person knew their place in this order, and crucially, each person understood their place as reflecting cosmic truth, not arbitrary human decision. This is the genius of early religious systems. They transformed social arrangements into sacred ones. It wasn't just convenient that some people ruled while others labored. It was divinely ordained. The gods themselves had established this order. To question it was to question the fundamental structure of reality. Stand back for a moment and consider what these early religious systems actually accomplished. They answered the most pressing questions facing any complex society. Why should anyone obey rules? Because the gods command it, and divine punishment awaits those who transgress. How do we coordinate large groups toward common goals? Through religious authorities who speak for the gods and direct collective action. What happens after death? The religious system provides answers, rewards for the faithful, punishments for the wicked, continuation rather than oblivion. But religion did something even more profound. It created shared identity among strangers. In a small village, trust comes from personal relationships. You know your neighbors, you grew up together. But in a city of thousands, you're surrounded by strangers. How do you know who to trust? How do you know who shares your values, who will honor agreements, who belongs to your community? Religious ritual provided the answer. If someone participates in the same ceremonies, worships at the same temples, follows the same food restrictions, observes the same holy days, they signal belonging. They demonstrate they accept the same cosmic order, the same moral framework, or the same authority. Religion transformed strangers into community members through visible acts of shared belief. This wasn't accidental. Early religious systems evolved through trial and error, through competition between cities and kingdoms toward forms that solved practical problems. Religious systems that motivated workers, legitimized authority, maintained order, and created cohesion, spread and persisted. Those that failed to do these things disappeared along with the societies that practiced them. Consider the strategic advantages religion offered. It legitimized authority without requiring constant coercion. People obeyed because they believed obedience was cosmically correct, not just because they feared punishment. It motivated workers to undertake massive projects by framing labor as sacred duty rather than mere toil. It maintained social order by providing moral frameworks that specified proper behavior and punished transgressions not just in this life, but in whatever came after. It created shared identity through ritual and belief, allowing cities and kingdoms to function as unified entities rather than collections of competing individuals. Religion became the operating system for civilization itself. Before courts and constitutions, before police forces and bureaucracies, before all the formal institutions of governance, religion provided the infrastructure that made complex societies possible. It wasn't just belief, it was the fundamental technology of social organization. The evidence surrounds us still. Visit the ruins of ancient temples, and you'll find storage rooms and administrative offices alongside sacred spaces. Study the earliest written records, and you'll find temple accounts tracking labor obligations and resource distribution. Examine the monuments that survived millennia, and you'll see the power that religious authority commanded not just over individual lives, but over vast collective efforts that required coordinating thousands of people across years or decades. This is what makes early religion so fascinating. It represents humanity's first systematic attempt to organize society beyond the scale of personal relationships. And it worked. It worked so well that its basic patterns, religious authority, legitimizing political power, ritual, creating community, belief, motivating sacrifice, would repeat throughout history, across cultures, in civilization after civilization. The priests of Mesopotamia weren't simply running temples, they were inventing governance. The pharaohs of Egypt weren't simply building tombs, they were demonstrating that belief could mobilize human effort on an almost unimaginable scale. These early religious systems provided the blueprint for organizing strangers into states, for coordinating massive projects, for creating something unprecedented in the natural world. Civilizations that could persist across generations, growing ever more complex, ever more capable of reshaping the world around them. As you contemplate this, recognize something profound. Every complex society you've ever known or read about has grappled with the same fundamental challenges. How do we get people to cooperate? How do we maintain order? How do we distribute resources? How do we create identity that transcends kinship? Religion provided humanity's first comprehensive answers to these questions. The solutions we've developed since laws and constitutions, markets and bureaucracies, nations and ideologies, all echo patterns established in those ancient temples along the Euphrates and the Nile. We are the inheritors of these innovations. When we accept authority, coordinate with strangers, participate in rituals that mark belonging, or organize ourselves into communities larger than our immediate circle, we're using technologies first developed by those early religious pioneers. They created tools for organizing human societies that proved so powerful, so adaptable, that they shaped everything that followed. And this was only the beginning. These early religious systems would evolve, compete, spread across continents, adapt to new circumstances, and continue shaping human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The story of religion is the story of how humans learned to cooperate at scale, and that story is far from finished. Something extraordinary happened between 800 and 200 years before the Common Era, a period scholars sometimes call the Axial Age. Across vast distances, In civilizations that had little or no contact with each other, human beings began asking a new kind of question. Not just, what do the gods want, but what is the right way to live? Not just, how do we maintain order, but what is justice? It was as if humanity simultaneously awakened to deeper possibilities. In this crucible of thought, multiple religious and philosophical systems emerged, each offering different answers, each competing for followers, each providing distinct strategic advantages to individuals and societies. This wasn't merely an evolution of belief, it was a marketplace of ideas, where different approaches to life's fundamental questions vied for influence and survival. Travel first to the foothills of the Himalayas, to northeastern India around 500 years before the Common Era. Here, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a fig tree and emerged claiming profound insight into the nature of suffering and its cessation. What he taught became Buddhism, and it represented something revolutionary in the religious landscape. Buddhism rejected the rigid caste system that dominated Indian society. The Brahmin priests claimed spiritual authority through birth, maintaining their position atop a hierarchy supposedly ordained by cosmic law. But the Buddha taught that enlightenment was available to anyone, regardless of birth or social position. Liberation came through understanding and practice, not through ritual or priestly intervention. Consider the implications. This was a direct challenge to existing power structures, yet Buddhism spread. Why? Because it offered strategic advantages to groups excluded from traditional Hindu authority. The merchant classes growing wealthy from expanding trade networks, but locked out of spiritual prestige by their birth, found Buddhism appealing. Here was a path to spiritual achievement that didn't require Brahmin blessing. Monasteries welcomed merchants' donations and offered them spiritual legitimacy. In return, Buddhism spread along trade routes, carried by merchants who saw in it both personal meaning and social elevation. Buddhism's genius lay in its adaptability. Unlike religions tied to specific rituals, deities, or sacred geography, Buddhism could integrate into different cultures without demanding total transformation. Local gods could be incorporated as protectors of the Dharma. Existing customs could continue alongside Buddhist practice. This flexibility made Buddhism remarkably successful at crossing cultural boundaries, a spiritual technology designed for portability. Now, shift your attention eastward to China, where during the same period, a teacher named Kongfuzi, known to us as Confucius, offered rulers something they desperately needed: a blueprint for stable government. China's Zhou dynasty was collapsing into chaos, with hundreds of small states competing for dominance. War was constant, authority was questioned, the old order was crumbling. Confucius proposed something radical yet practical: rule by merit rather than birth alone. Government officials should be selected through examination, testing their knowledge of classical texts and ethical principles. Society should be organized around reciprocal relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, each with clear obligations. Proper behavior, ritual correctness, and moral cultivation would create harmony more effectively than force. This wasn't just philosophy, it was administrative technology. Confucianism gave rulers a system for identifying capable administrators, a framework for legitimizing their authority through moral virtue, rather than just military power, and a comprehensive social order that promised stability without requiring constant coercion. When the Han Dynasty unified China around 200 years before the Common Era, they adopted Confucianism as official ideology. Why? Because it worked. It provided the intellectual infrastructure for a centralized bureaucratic state that would persist for 2 millennia. The examination system created a class of educated officials loyal to the state rather than to local warlords. Confucian emphasis on filial piety and hierarchy reinforced social order. The promise that virtuous rule would bring cosmic harmony motivated rulers to at least appear moral. Confucianism survived because governments found it useful, a remarkable testament to its practical power. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, a small people developed perhaps the most surprising survival strategy in religious history. The Jews repeatedly conquered, dispersed, denied political power, created a religion that could survive without territory, without temples, without centralized authority. How do you maintain a people's identity when you have no land to call home? Judaism's answer was brilliant: make the law portable. While other ancient peoples' religions centered on temples and sacred geography, Judaism centered on a text and on practices that could be performed anywhere. Circumcision, dietary restrictions, Sabbath observance, these required no temple, no priesthood, no homeland. They marked Jewish identity wherever Jews lived. The Torah became a portable homeland, carried in scrolls, memorized, studied, transmitted from generation to generation. This represents an extraordinary adaptive strategy. When the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 586 before the Common Era and exiled the Jewish elite, Judaism should have disappeared like countless other conquered peoples' religions. Instead, it intensified. The exile forced innovation. Synagogues emerged as local centers of worship and study. Rabbis replaced priests as religious authorities, their legitimacy based on learning rather than lineage. Study itself became a form of worship. Judaism also developed what evolutionary scholars call costly signals, requirements that demonstrate commitment. Maintaining kosher dietary laws, especially in diaspora communities, marked you unmistakably as Jewish. Circumcision was a permanent physical sign. Sabbath observance required abstaining from work one day in 7, a significant economic sacrifice. These requirements served as membership tests. Only the truly committed would pay such costs, which made Jewish communities remarkably cohesive. Trust was high because membership itself proved dedication. Now turn your attention to Greece, where philosophers were proposing something even more radical, that truth could be discovered through reason rather than revelation. Socrates wandered Athens asking unsettling questions. Plato imagined ideal forms beyond physical reality. Aristotle systematically categorized knowledge across disciplines. This represented a fundamentally different approach to understanding the world. Greek philosophy introduced the possibility that humans could figure things out through logic, observation, and debate without appealing to gods or sacred texts. This was dangerous to traditional religious authority. If reason could discover truth, why did you need priests? If logical argument could settle disputes, why did you need divine judgment? Yet Greek philosophy spread because it offered powerful tools: systematic thinking, logical analysis, empirical observation. It provided methods for understanding nature, ethics, politics, and metaphysics that didn't depend on faith. The tension between reason and revelation would echo through Western thought for millennia. Christianity would struggle to reconcile Greek philosophy with biblical faith. Islam would debate whether reason or scripture should take precedence. The scientific revolution would eventually privilege empirical observation over traditional authority. But in this ancient period, Greek philosophy represented one option among many, a distinct approach to life's fundamental questions, competing for allegiance in the marketplace of ideas. Further east, in ancient Persia, a prophet named Zarathustra was teaching something that would reshape religious thought: cosmic dualism. Life, he proclaimed, was fundamentally a battle between good and evil, truth and lies, light and darkness. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, opposed Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Every person faced a choice: align yourself with good or with evil. Your choices mattered cosmically. And after death, you would face judgment. Zoroastrianism introduced concepts that seem familiar now, but were revolutionary then: heaven and hell as reward and punishment, a final judgment day, the world as moral battleground, individual choice as spiritually decisive. These ideas would profoundly influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But in its original context, Zoroastrianism created highly motivated believers. If every action counted in a cosmic struggle, every choice mattered. This wasn't just about maintaining social order, it was about the ultimate fate of reality itself. The Persian Empire adopted Zoroastrianism, and it provided ideological justification for their imperial project. They weren't just conquering territory, they were spreading truth and order against chaos and lies. This moral framework motivated soldiers, legitimized rulers, and provided a compelling answer to why their empire should exist. Religion, as imperial ideology, reached new sophistication. Step back now and consider what these diverse systems reveal. Each emerged in response to specific circumstances, each offered distinct advantages, and each succeeded or failed based on how well it solved human problems. Buddhism spread because it adapted easily to different cultures and appealed to excluded groups. Confucianism survived because rulers found it useful for governance. Judaism persisted because it developed portable practices that maintained identity without political power. Greek philosophy spread because it offered powerful analytical tools. Zoroastrianism succeeded because it motivated believers with cosmic stakes. This was genuine competition, not military, but ideological. Different religious and philosophical systems competed for followers, for patronage, for influence. The winners weren't necessarily the most true in any metaphysical sense. They were the most successful at attracting and retaining adherents, at solving problems for individuals and societies, at adapting to changing circumstances. Consider the mechanisms of religious success. Adaptability mattered enormously. Buddhism's willingness to incorporate local deities and customs made it far more successful at spreading than more rigid systems. Utility to rulers provided crucial support Confucianism endured because governments invested in it. Strong community bonds, created through costly signals like Judaism's dietary laws, generated cohesion and loyalty. Compelling answers to existential questions attracted genuine believers. Strategic advantages in trade, governance, or social organization provided material benefits alongside spiritual ones. Religions also competed through networks. Buddhism spread along trade routes because merchants carried it. Confucianism spread through conquest as Chinese empires expanded. Greek philosophy spread through Alexander's conquests and subsequent Hellenistic culture. Judaism spread through diaspora communities, maintaining contact through trade and correspondence. Zoroastrianism spread through Persian imperial administration. The mechanisms of transmission mattered as much as the content of belief. What we're witnessing in this period is religious diversification, the emergence of distinct approaches to fundamental questions, each offering different strategies for living, each providing different frameworks for organizing society, each promising different rewards. Some emphasized individual enlightenment, others social harmony. Some stressed moral choice, others ritual correctness. Some promised escape from suffering, others success in this world. And here's what makes this so fascinating. Many of these systems would persist for millennia. Buddhism would spread across Asia, adapting to each culture it encountered. Confucianism would shape Chinese civilization and influence Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Judaism would survive dispersion, persecution, and attempts at annihilation. Greek philosophy would become foundational to Western thought. Zoroastrianism would directly influence the development of Christianity and Islam before largely fading, yet leaving its imprint on successor religions. The systems that emerged during this axial age weren't just ancient curiosities. They created the basic religious and philosophical categories that still organize much of human belief. The questions they asked remain our questions. What is the right way to live? How should society be organized? What happens after death? What is the nature of ultimate reality? What obligations do we owe each other? Their answers still shape billions of lives, but competition didn't end with the Axial Age. These systems would continue evolving, encountering each other, adapting to new circumstances, competing for followers and influence. Religion remained dynamic, responding to changing needs, incorporating new ideas, splitting into factions, merging with local traditions. The marketplace of ideas never closed. It only grew more complex. As you consider these ancient innovations, recognize that they represent humanity, experimenting with different ways of organizing meaning and society. Not every experiment succeeded. Countless religious systems have disappeared, leaving only archaeological traces. But those that survived did so by solving problems, providing community, meaning, governance frameworks, moral systems, answers to existential questions. They were technologies for living, competing, and evolving in response to human needs, and the competition was just beginning. These systems would soon encounter each other more directly, clash over resources and authority, adapt to imperial expansion, and transform as they spread across continents. The story grows more complex, more interconnected, more consequential with each passing century. Imagine standing in Rome around the year 100 of the Common Era. You walk through streets filled with temples to Jupiter and Mars, to Isis from Egypt, to Mithras from Persia, to Cybele from Anatolia. The Roman Empire didn't just tolerate religious diversity, it actively incorporated it. This wasn't mere generosity. It was strategy. The Romans understood something profound about empire. You cannot rule a vast, diverse territory through force alone. Conquest is expensive. Garrison troops cost money. Rebellions drain resources. But if conquered peoples feel included in the imperial project, if they see Roman rule as beneficial rather than oppressive, they govern themselves. And one of the most elegant ways to include conquered peoples was to let them keep their gods. Roman polytheism was remarkably flexible. When Rome conquered a new territory, they didn't demand religious conversion. Instead, they often added local deities to the Roman pantheon, identifying them with Roman gods through a process called syncretism. Your war god became Mars, your sky god became Jupiter, your goddess of love became Venus. This allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religious practices while becoming Roman. It eased assimilation, reduced resentment, and cost the empire nothing. But there was a requirement. You had to acknowledge Rome's divine mandate. You had to participate in imperial cult, offering sacrifices to the genius of the emperor, recognizing Rome's gods alongside your own. This wasn't really about belief, it was about loyalty. By participating in Roman religious ritual, you demonstrated allegiance to Rome. Refusal signaled rebellion. For most people, this posed no problem. Adding Roman gods alongside local deities was easy in a polytheistic framework. But then Christianity appeared, and everything changed. Christianity was different. It demanded exclusive loyalty. There was one God and no others. Christians refused to sacrifice to Roman gods or the imperial cult. To Roman authorities, this looked like sedition. If you won't honor Rome's gods, if you won't acknowledge the emperor's divine status, how can we trust your loyalty? Christians seemed to threaten the very mechanism that held the empire together. The result was persecution, sporadic at first, then more systematic. Christians were blamed for disasters, accused of atheism for rejecting traditional gods, suspected of dangerous secret practices. Yet persecution had an unexpected effect. It demonstrated Christianity's strength. These people were willing to die for their beliefs. They faced execution, singing hymns. They refused to recant even under torture. Such commitment proved the power of their faith. Moreover, persecution created tight-knit communities. When everyone might betray you, when attending worship could mean death, trust becomes paramount. Christian communities developed strong bonds, extensive support networks, and powerful sense of identity. They cared for their sick, buried their dead, supported widows and orphans, and helped members in need. This mutual aid attracted converts, especially among the urban poor who had no other safety net. Christianity also offered something philosophically compelling: meaning for suffering. In a world where disease, poverty, and early death were common, Christianity taught that suffering had purpose. The poor would inherit the kingdom of heaven. The meek would be exalted. Earthly injustice would be corrected in the afterlife. And God himself had suffered, had been tortured, humiliated, killed, which meant suffering brought you closer to the divine rather than marking divine disfavor. By the early 4th century, perhaps 10% of the Roman Empire was Christian, a substantial minority, organized into efficient networks, motivated by profound conviction, impossible to eradicate. And then, Emperor Constantine made a calculation that would reshape history. Constantine faced civil war against rival claimants to imperial power. Before the decisive Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, he claimed to see a vision, a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this actually happened, or whether Constantine found it politically convenient to claim it had, the result was clear. Constantine won the battle, attributed victory to the Christian God, and began favoring Christianity. Why would an emperor support what had been a persecuted minority religion? Consider the strategic calculation. Christianity offered organizational advantages. It had efficient administrative networks spanning the empire, bishops, presbyters, deacons, coordinating across provinces. It had motivated, literate believers who could serve as loyal administrators. It provided moral authority independent of military power, divine legitimacy for imperial rule, and perhaps most importantly, it offered ideological unity for a fragmenting empire. The traditional Roman gods were losing credibility. Why had they allowed barbarian invasions? Why couldn't they prevent plague and economic collapse? Christianity offered a compelling alternative: one God, one truth, one church, one empire. It provided an ideological framework for unity that polytheism, with its multiplicity of gods and cults, could not match. Constantine didn't make Christianity the state religion immediately that came later under Theodosius, but he gave Christianity imperial patronage. He funded church construction, exempted clergy from taxes, presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve theological disputes. Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to imperial religion in less than a generation. Consider what this reveals about religion and power. Christianity succeeded not just because of its spiritual message, but because it offered practical advantages to imperial administration. Its organizational structure, its motivated believers, its unifying ideology, these made it useful to rulers. And once it had imperial backing, Christianity could spread through mechanisms unavailable to persecuted minorities: official promotion, legal privileges, access to resources, integration into education and government. But let us shift our view eastward, to the Silk Roads connecting China with the Mediterranean. Here, Buddhism was spreading not through imperial patronage but through trade networks. Merchants carried more than silk and spices, they carried ideas. Buddhist monks traveled with caravans, established monasteries along trade routes, and translated texts into local languages. Buddhism's spread along the Silk Roads demonstrates different strategic mechanisms. Merchants benefited from Buddhist monasteries, which provided safe lodging, banking services, and neutral ground for conducting business. Monasteries needed merchant donations to fund construction and support monks. This created a mutually beneficial relationship. Merchants gained logistical support and spiritual merit. Buddhism, gained funding and transmission across cultural boundaries. Buddhist missionaries also proved remarkably skilled at adapting their message. In China, they translated Sanskrit terms using Taoist concepts to make Buddhism comprehensible. They didn't demand the abandonment of Confucian family rituals or veneration of ancestors. Instead, they positioned Buddhism as compatible with existing Chinese practices, an addition rather than a replacement. This flexibility allowed Buddhism to penetrate Chinese culture despite initial resistance. Moreover, Buddhism offered rulers something valuable, a source of legitimacy independent of Confucian bureaucracy. Emperors could patronize Buddhist monasteries, position themselves as defenders of the Dharma, and use Buddhism to balance Confucian literati who might challenge imperial authority. Religion provided rulers with options, multiple sources of legitimacy, multiple constituencies to balance against each other. Turn your attention now to India, where Hindu rulers were using religion in yet another way. Demonstration of power through architectural grandeur. The great temple complexes Khajuraho, Konark, Madurai weren't just places of worship. They were economic engines, political statements, and artistic achievements that proclaimed the glory of their royal patrons. A major Hindu temple was like a medieval European cathedral. It employed hundreds of people: priests, musicians, dancers, craftsmen, administrators, guards. It owned vast agricultural lands that generated revenue. It sponsored festivals that attracted pilgrims from distant regions, bringing trade and wealth. It served as bank, hospital, school, and cultural center, and it proclaimed its patrons' devotion, wealth, and power. When a king commissioned a magnificent temple complex, covered in intricate carvings depicting gods and myths, he wasn't just serving religious purposes. He was displaying his ability to command resources and labor. He was creating employment and economic activity. He was attracting pilgrims and trade. He was demonstrating his devotion to the gods, which legitimized his rule. He was leaving a legacy that would outlast his lifetime. Temple construction was statecraft. The political economy of these great religious institutions reveals how deeply intertwined religion and power had become. Temples and churches weren't separate from economic and political systems. They were integral parts of those systems. They managed wealth, employed labor, provided services, generated revenue, and legitimized authority. Religion had become infrastructural. Consider how this changed the stakes of religious competition. Different religious institutions competed for royal patronage, for donations, for influence. Rulers chose which temples or churches to support, based partly on devotion, but also on strategic calculation. Which institution will provide the most legitimacy? Which has the most influential supporters? Which offers the best return on investment through services provided and loyalty generated? This created a kind of religious marketplace, where institutions competed for resources and influence. Successful religious institutions developed effective strategies. They provided valuable services beyond worship: education, healthcare, dispute resolution, banking, social welfare. They created compelling rituals and festivals that attracted participation. They produced theology and art that resonated with believers. They maintained networks connecting distant communities. They cultivated relationships with wealthy and powerful patrons. Those institutions that failed to compete effectively, that couldn't attract donations, that lost royal favor, that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances, declined or disappeared. Religious history isn't just about theology and belief. It's also about institutional competition, resource management, strategic adaptation, and survival in complex political and economic environments. By the year 500 of the Common Era, religion and empire had become thoroughly intertwined across Eurasia. Christianity had gone from persecuted minority to state religion of Rome, and was spreading beyond imperial borders into Ethiopia, Armenia, Persia. Buddhism had become established in China and was beginning to influence Korea and Japan. Hinduism dominated South Asia, supported by powerful temple institutions. Zoroastrianism remained strong in Persia. Judaism persisted in diaspora communities across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Each religious system had developed sophisticated relationships with political power. Some, like Christianity in the late Roman Empire, achieved state support and used imperial resources for expansion. Others, like Buddhism along the Silk Roads, spread through trade networks and merchant patronage. Still others, like Hinduism in India, became integral to local political systems through temple-based economics. And Judaism demonstrated that religion could persist without political power through strong community bonds and portable practices. What emerges from this period is a clear pattern. Religion and imperial strategy became inseparable. Rulers used religion to legitimize authority, unify diverse populations, motivate subjects, and project power. Religious institutions used political patronage to gain resources, protection, and influence. Neither religion nor empire operated independently. They co-evolved, shaped each other, and together organized societies on unprecedented scales. This wasn't cynical manipulation. Rulers genuinely believed, and religious leaders genuinely sought spiritual goals. But belief and strategy intertwined. Constantine's vision at Milvian Bridge might have been genuine religious experience and strategic political move simultaneously. Buddhist missionaries might have been sincerely devoted to spreading enlightenment and also skilled at leveraging trade networks. Hindu kings might have been truly pious and also acutely aware of temples' political benefits. Human motivations are complex. The same action can serve spiritual and strategic purposes. Religion's power came precisely from this dual nature. It provided meaning and purpose, while also solving practical problems of governance, coordination, and social organization. This made it extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily persistent. As empires rose and fell, as trade routes shifted, as populations migrated, religion adapted. It provided continuity through change, identity across geography, authority beyond military force. It was the most sophisticated technology humanity had yet developed for organizing societies at scale, and it was about to face its greatest test, as new empires would emerge and new religions would challenge the existing order. In the year 610 of the Common Era, in a cave outside Mecca, a merchant named Muhammad reported receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel. Within a century, the religious and political movement he inspired would control territory, stretching from Spain to Central Asia, one of the most rapid expansions in human history. How did this happen? What strategic factors enabled Islam's extraordinary success? Begin with the message itself. Islam proclaimed radical equality before God. In a society stratified by tribe and lineage, where your birth determined your status, Islam taught that all believers were equal in Allah's eyes. The rich and poor, the powerful and weak, the Arab and non-Arab all stood as equals before their Creator. This was revolutionary. It appealed particularly to those excluded from traditional power structures: merchants, freedmen, slaves, members of minor tribes. But Islam offered more than spiritual equality. It provided a comprehensive legal framework, the Sharia, that governed everything from prayer and fasting to commerce, inheritance, and warfare. This was crucial for managing diverse populations. As Arab armies conquered territory after territory, they needed systems for administering vastly different peoples: Persians, Egyptians, Berbers, Greeks. Islamic law provided standardized rules that could apply across cultures, creating predictability and order. Consider the strategic advantages this offered. Previous empires struggled with legal pluralism. Different peoples followed different laws, creating confusion and opportunities for exploitation. Islamic law offered consistency. A merchant in Damascus knew the same rules would apply in Baghdad or Cairo. Inheritance disputes could be resolved using standard procedures, whether you were in Spain or Afghanistan. This legal consistency facilitated trade, reduced conflict, and made the Islamic Empire remarkably efficient. The early Muslim community also developed sophisticated military innovations. Arab warriors perfected cavalry tactics, using superior mobility to defeat larger, more heavily armored forces. They understood logistics, maintaining supply lines across vast distances and harsh terrain. They employed psychological warfare, offering generous terms to cities that surrendered peacefully while ruthlessly destroying those that resisted. This combination of carrot and stick encouraged capitulation. But here's what made Islamic expansion truly remarkable: the treatment of conquered peoples. Unlike many conquerors who extracted wealth and left, Muslim rulers established systems for long-term administration. Non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians could keep their religions by paying a special tax, the jizya. This created revenue without requiring forced conversion. It also meant conquered peoples had incentives to accept Muslim rule. Keep your faith, maintain your communities, follow your own religious laws in internal matters, just pay taxes, and don't rebel. This policy proved extraordinarily effective. Many conquered peoples found Muslim rule preferable to previous rulers. Christians in Syria and Egypt, for example, had been oppressed by Byzantine emperors who considered their theological views heretical. Muslim rulers didn't care about Christian theological disputes. Pay your taxes, live peacefully, and practice your faith as you wish. This religious tolerance, strategic and pragmatic, won loyalty more effectively than coercion. Conversion, when it happened, was often gradual and voluntary, driven by social and economic advantages. Muslims paid lower taxes. Islamic courts might be more favorable. Arabic became the language of commerce and administration, creating incentives to learn it, and learning Arabic meant encountering Islamic texts. Intermarriage between conquerors and conquered blurred boundaries. Over generations, many populations converted not through force, but through the accumulated weight of small advantages and social integration. Trade networks reinforced religious expansion. Muslim merchants traveled from West Africa to Southeast Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. They carried not just goods but also religious teachers, legal texts, and architectural styles. Mosques appeared in trading ports, serving as community centers for Muslim merchants and introducing local populations to Islamic practices. Conversion often followed trade relationships if your business partners are Muslim, if Islamic law facilitates commerce, if the Muslim community offers support networks. Joining that community made practical sense. Now, shift attention westward to Europe, where Christianity and Islam clashed in what Europeans called the Crusades. Beginning in 1095, European nobles launched military campaigns to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. These campaigns, lasting over 2 centuries, reveal competing strategic approaches. For European crusaders, the motivation was complex. Religious devotion certainly, but also hunger for land, desire for adventure, hope for salvation, and political ambition. Younger sons of nobles, who wouldn't inherit estates, saw opportunities for wealth and status in the East. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa saw opportunities for trade advantages. Popes saw opportunities to extend their authority and unite fractious European kingdoms under religious banner. But crusaders faced enormous challenges. Supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers across hostile territory. Local populations, whether Christian or Muslim, often resented foreign armies passing through their lands. European knights, trained for individual combat and short campaigns, struggled with the prolonged sieges and unfamiliar tactics of Middle Eastern warfare. Most devastating, crusaders didn't understand the environment. Heat, disease, and unfamiliar terrain killed more than combat. Muslim defenders, by contrast, possessed crucial advantages. They fought on familiar ground, They had shorter supply lines. They could draw on local resources and intelligence. They understood the rhythm of warfare in arid climates, when to fight, when to withdraw to fortified positions, when to strike at overextended enemies. And after initial disunity, Muslim forces eventually unified under capable leaders like Saladin, whose military genius and strategic patience systematically reversed Crusader conquests. The economics underlying these religious conflicts tell their own story. Crusades were extraordinarily expensive. Equipping a knight, transporting armies, maintaining castles and garrisons all required vast resources. European kingdoms bankrupted themselves funding crusades. Meanwhile, Muslim states controlled lucrative trade routes between East and West. Spices, silk, and luxury goods flowed through Muslim territories, generating enormous customs revenue. The economic imbalance favored the defenders. Control of Jerusalem wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Pilgrimage was big business. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all considered Jerusalem sacred, and pilgrims needed food, lodging, guides, and protection. Taxing pilgrims generated significant revenue, but the religious significance mattered too. Controlling holy sites provided legitimacy, demonstrated divine favor, and inspired believers. The Crusades were simultaneously about faith, power, wealth, and prestige inseparably intertwined. While Christianity and Islam clashed in the Mediterranean, Buddhism was spreading peacefully across East Asia through very different mechanisms. Buddhist missionaries to China, Korea, and Japan employed sophisticated strategies for cultural adaptation. They didn't arrive with armies, they came as teachers, translators, and artists. Consider how Buddhism entered Japan in the 6th century. Korean monks presented Buddhist texts and statues to the Japanese court as gifts, sophisticated, beautiful objects associated with continental civilization. Buddhism became fashionable among Japanese aristocracy before it became widespread among common people. Elite adoption created prestige, which encouraged broader acceptance. This was missionary work as cultural diplomacy. Buddhist translators performed remarkable work, rendering Sanskrit and Chinese texts into local languages while adapting concepts to make them comprehensible. They identified local deities as manifestations of Buddhist figures. Shinto kami became bodhisattvas protecting the Dharma. This syncretism allowed Buddhism to coexist with indigenous beliefs rather than demanding their abandonment. The same pattern repeated across East Asia. Buddhism adapted to local religious landscapes, incorporating rather than replacing existing practices. Buddhist monasteries also provided valuable services that won local support. They offered education, healthcare, dispute resolution, and sanctuary. Monasteries became cultural centers, preserving texts, creating art, developing architecture, and advancing learning. Rulers patronized monasteries because they provided these services and because association with Buddhism conveyed sophistication and connection to prestigious Chinese civilization. The strategic choice of peaceful missionary work versus military conquest reveals something profound about religious expansion. Buddhism spread through persuasion, adaptation, and service provision slower than military conquest, but ultimately reaching vast populations and persisting for millennia. Islam spread through a combination of military conquest and subsequent voluntary conversion faster initially, but requiring sophisticated administration to maintain control. Christianity spread through imperial patronage in Rome, missionary work in Northern Europe, and crusading campaigns in the Middle East, each context requiring different strategies. What determined missionary success? Several factors emerge from this historical record. Timing mattered enormously. Buddhism succeeded in East Asia partly because it arrived when rulers sought sources of legitimacy and cultural sophistication. Resources proved crucial. Missionaries needed funding for travel, text production, and monastery construction. Political backing provided protection and prestige. Rulers who supported a religion gave it advantages impossible to achieve through grassroots effort alone. Message adaptation was essential. Religions that could incorporate local practices spread more easily than those demanding total transformation. Buddhism's flexibility gave it advantages. Christianity's exclusivity denied. But exclusivity had its own strategic value. It created clear boundaries, strong identity, and motivated believers willing to resist compromise. Trade-offs existed between adaptability and distinctiveness. Miracles, whether real or claimed, provided compelling evidence of religious power. Stories of miraculous healings, prophetic visions, and divine interventions attracted believers and validated religious claims. Every major religion developed miracle narratives: Muhammad's night journey, Buddha's levitation, Christian saints' healings, Hindu deities' manifestations. Whether literal truth or persuasive mythology, these stories demonstrated that the religion offered access to powers beyond ordinary human capacity. Sacred architecture served strategic purposes beyond worship. Magnificent mosques, soaring cathedrals, elaborate temples, and graceful pagodas all proclaimed religious power, attracted pilgrims, employed artisans, and became landmarks, organizing space and community. Architecture was missionary work in stone, permanent, visible, impressive. A beautiful building could convert through aesthetic experience what arguments might never achieve. By the year 1300, the religious map of Eurasia had been transformed. Islam dominated from Spain through North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and into South Asia. Christianity controlled Europe, had established footholds in the Crusader states, and was beginning to expand into Baltic regions. Buddhism flourished across East and Southeast Asia. Hinduism remained strong in India despite Islamic expansion. Judaism persisted in diaspora communities throughout Christian and Islamic territories. These religious zones weren't isolated. Trade, warfare, diplomacy, and migration constantly brought different faiths into contact. Sometimes this produced conflict, crusades, jihads, persecutions. Sometimes it produced creative exchange. Islamic scholars translating Greek philosophy, Christian theologians engaging with Jewish and Muslim thought, Buddhist and Hindu ideas blending in Southeast Asia. Religion was dynamic, constantly encountering difference, responding to challenge, adapting to context. The competition between religious systems continued to drive innovation. To attract converts, religions needed compelling messages, effective organizations, charismatic leaders, and tangible benefits. To retain believers, they needed proof. To adapt to changing circumstances without losing distinctive identity. To expand, they needed strategies appropriate to contexts, sometimes military conquest, sometimes peaceful persuasion, sometimes elite adoption, sometimes grassroots movement. What's striking is how much religious expansion depended on non-religious factors: military power, trade networks, political alliances, economic resources, technological advantages like printing or shipbuilding, all shaped which religions spread where. Sacred truth alone didn't determine outcomes. The most sublime theology meant nothing if you couldn't translate texts, transport missionaries, fund institutions, or win political support. Religious success required spiritual and strategic dimensions working together. As we witness these great religions expanding across continents, competing for followers, adapting to new contexts, and reshaping societies, remember, these weren't inevitable processes. Buddhism might have remained a minor Indian sect. Islam might have stayed confined to Arabia. Christianity might have disappeared under Roman persecution. Each successful expansion required countless decisions, strategic choices, fortunate timing, and effective execution. Religion shaped history, but history also shaped religion. a constant, dynamic interaction between belief and circumstance, faith and strategy, transcendent claims and earthly realities. And the story grows more complex still. Religious competition would intensify as religions splintered internally, as new technologies transformed communication and warfare, and as European expansion would carry Christianity to previously uncontacted continents. The age of global religious encounter was approaching, bringing unprecedented challenges and transformations. On October 31st, 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg. This simple act, posting arguments for academic debate, would shatter the religious unity of Western Europe and transform the political landscape for centuries. But here's what makes this moment so revealing. Luther's challenge to Rome wasn't merely theological, it was fundamentally about power, wealth, and authority. Consider what Luther was protesting. The Catholic Church was selling indulgences, documents promising reduced time in purgatory for yourself or deceased loved ones. Pope Leo X needed money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, one of the most expensive construction projects in history. So the Church authorized agents like Johann Tetzel to sell these spiritual guarantees across Germany. Tetzel's sales pitch was blunt. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. This offended Luther theologically. Salvation couldn't be purchased. It came through faith alone. But it also offended him practically. German money was flowing to Rome, enriching Italian bankers and funding Italian architecture while German parishes struggled. The financial extraction was blatant, and many Germans resented it. Luther's protest tapped into nationalist resentment as much as religious conviction. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, transformed Luther's local dispute into continent-wide crisis. Within weeks, Luther's theses had been translated from Latin into German and printed thousands of times. Within months, they'd spread across Europe. For the first time in history, a religious controversy could reach mass audiences almost instantaneously. The technology of communication reshaped the politics of belief. Luther's writings became bestsellers, something impossible in manuscript culture. His German translation of the Bible made scripture accessible to common people rather than limiting it to Latin-reading clergy. This democratized religious authority. If anyone could read scripture, why did you need priests to interpret it? If salvation came through faith rather than sacraments, why did you need the elaborate church hierarchy? Luther's theology implied a flatter, less expensive, more accessible religious structure. Now here's where strategic calculation enters. German princes were watching this dispute closely, and many saw opportunity. The Catholic Church owned enormous amounts of land in Germany, perhaps 1/3 of all territory. Church property was exempt from taxation. Church courts claimed jurisdiction over clergy, removing them from secular law. Church appointments went to Rome's favorites, often Italians who'd never visited their German diocese but collected revenue from them. When Luther challenged papal authority, he was questioning who controlled this wealth and power. German princes recognized that if they supported Luther, they could claim church lands, taxation rights, and appointment authority for themselves. This wasn't cynical manipulation. Many princes genuinely found Luther's theology convincing. But religious conviction and political advantage aligned beautifully. Supporting Protestantism meant asserting independence from Rome and claiming resources the Church controlled. The pattern repeated across northern Europe. In Scandinavia, monarchs broke with Rome and established Lutheran state churches, seizing monastery lands to fund royal administration. In Switzerland, cities like Zurich and Geneva adopted reformed Protestantism, asserting urban independence against Catholic bishops and princes. In the Netherlands, Calvinist merchants and nobles used religious difference to justify rebellion against Catholic Spanish rule. Religion became the language through which political conflicts expressed themselves. Consider England, perhaps the clearest example of religious change serving political purposes. King Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, who'd failed to produce a male heir. Pope Clement VII refused permission, partly because Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor who'd just sacked Rome and effectively held the Pope prisoner. Henry couldn't get his divorce while the Pope feared Charles. Henry's solution was radical: declare the English Church independent from Rome, with himself as supreme head. This wasn't initially about Protestant theology. Henry remained theologically conservative, but establishing the Church of England gave Henry what he needed: the authority to grant his own divorce, control over religious appointments in England, and seizure of monastery lands that enriched the crown and created a class of nobles invested in maintaining the break from Rome. Over subsequent reigns, English religion would oscillate between Catholic and Protestant as monarchs with different convictions took power. But the underlying principle remained: the ruler determines religious policy. This became formalized in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 and reinforced in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Religion had become explicitly an instrument of state power. The religious wars that convulsed Europe for over a century weren't just about theology. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, devastated German territories, but had as much to do with French Habsburg rivalry and Swedish imperial ambitions as with Catholic-Protestant disagreement. Religion provided the ideological framework, the motivation for soldiers, the justification for intervention, but underneath lay contests for territory, resources, and political dominance. Yet here's what makes religious division so strategically significant: it created genuine commitment. Soldiers fought more fiercely when they believed God was on their side. Populations endured suffering when they saw it as religious martyrdom. Rulers gained legitimacy by defending the true faith against heretics or papists. Religion transformed political conflicts into cosmic struggles between good and evil, truth and falsehood, salvation and damnation. This intensified conflict, but also motivated extraordinary sacrifice and determination. Now shift your view eastward to the Ottoman Empire, where a very different approach to religious diversity was unfolding. The Ottomans ruled over Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others, a bewildering religious diversity that might have torn the empire apart. Their solution was the millet system, allowing each religious community to govern itself in internal matters while owing loyalty and taxes to the Sultan. Greek Orthodox Christians formed one millet, with their patriarch administering religious law, education, and community affairs for all Orthodox subjects. Armenians formed another millet, Jews another. Each community collected its own taxes, which it then paid to Ottoman authorities. Each maintained its own religious institutions, courts, and schools. As long as communities paid taxes, provided military service when required, and didn't rebel, the Sultan didn't interfere in their internal religious practices. This system proved remarkably stable for centuries. Religious communities had incentives to maintain order within their own populations. Disorder might provoke Ottoman intervention or higher taxes. Religious leaders became stakeholders in Ottoman administration, and allowing communities autonomy in matters they cared deeply about reduced resistance to Ottoman rule in matters the Sultan cared about, primarily revenue and military recruitment. Compare this to European religious wars happening simultaneously. While Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other over theological differences, the Ottoman Empire managed religious diversity through administrative pragmatism. Neither approach was morally superior, both served the interests of rulers attempting to govern diverse populations, but they reveal different strategic choices: forced uniformity versus managed diversity, ideological purity versus practical tolerance. Travel now to India, where the Mughal Empire was conducting its own experiment with religious policy. Emperor Akbar, ruling from 1556 to 1605, faced a challenge. How could a Muslim dynasty govern a predominantly Hindu population? Previous Muslim rulers had imposed jizya tax on non-Muslims and sometimes destroyed Hindu temples, creating resentment and resistance. Akbar chose differently. He abolished the jizya, married Hindu princesses, included Hindu nobles in government, protected Hindu temples, and even attempted to create a syncretic religion, Din-i-Ilahi, blending elements from Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. This wasn't mere tolerance. It was active religious pluralism as governing strategy. Akbar believed unity required respect for diversity, that stable rule depended on buy-in from subject populations. His approach worked. The Mughal Empire flourished under Akbar, expanding territory, generating enormous wealth, and producing remarkable artistic and architectural achievements. Hindu and Muslim nobles collaborated in administration. Trade flourished. Cultural synthesis created new art forms, new musical traditions, new architectural styles. Religious diversity became a source of strength rather than weakness. But later, Mughal emperors reversed this policy. Aurangzeb, ruling from 1658 to 1707, reimposed jizya, destroyed some Hindu temples, and favored Muslim nobles over Hindus. This orthodox Islamic policy coincided with perhaps caused increasing rebellion, regional independence movements, and eventual Mughal decline. The strategic calculation had shifted, and consequences followed. These examples reveal a fundamental tension in religious politics, the trade-off between unity and diversity. Enforced religious uniformity potentially creates stronger collective identity and reduces internal conflict. Everyone shares the same worldview, the same rituals, the same loyalties. But achieving uniformity requires coercion, creates resentment among minorities, and can provoke resistance that undermines stability. Religious tolerance allows diverse populations to coexist, reduces resistance, and can generate cultural creativity through synthesis. But it potentially weakens collective identity, creates competing loyalties, and might enable groups to organize against the state using religious networks. Rulers had to choose: invest in forced conversion and risk rebellion, or accept diversity and manage competing claims. The Dutch revolt against Spain illustrates this tension perfectly. The Spanish Netherlands was religiously diverse. Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, all present in significant numbers. Spanish King Philip II, fervently Catholic, attempted to impose religious uniformity through the Inquisition. Dutch nobles, even those who were Catholic, resented this interference in local affairs. Calvinist merchants, artisans, and sailors became the core of resistance. Calvinism itself provided ideological justification for rebellion. If only God's law was absolute, earthly rulers had limited authority. If conscience must be obeyed, forcing religious conformity was tyranny. If the elect were known by faith rather than birth, social hierarchy could be challenged. Calvin hadn't intended his theology as revolutionary political doctrine, but in Dutch hands, it became exactly that. The Dutch eventually won independence, establishing a republic with remarkable, though not complete, religious tolerance. This served strategic purposes. Tolerance attracted skilled immigrants fleeing persecution elsewhere, including Jewish merchants and Protestant craftsmen. These immigrants brought capital, skills, and trade connections that made Amsterdam a commercial powerhouse. Religious tolerance proved economically advantageous, which reinforced political support for maintaining it. Meanwhile, France was struggling with its own religious division. After decades of religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots King Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting Huguenots limited rights to worship, hold office, and maintain fortified cities. This pragmatic tolerance pacified religious conflict and allowed France to focus on external enemies rather than internal division. But in 1685, King Louis XIV revoked the edict, banning Protestant worship and triggering mass emigration of perhaps 200,000 Huguenots, many of them skilled artisans, merchants, and professionals. France lost talent and capital while Protestant nations like England, the Netherlands, and Prussia gained valuable immigrants. The strategic miscalculation was enormous. Religious uniformity was purchased at the price of economic and demographic loss. Throughout this period, religious policy was explicitly strategic. Rulers made calculated choices about uniformity versus tolerance, often changing policy based on circumstances. Religion wasn't separate from politics, it was a primary tool of statecraft, a source of legitimacy, a framework for organizing society, and a cause worth fighting for or about. What emerges from this era of religious division is a clear pattern. Disagreements about theology became inseparable from contests over political authority, economic resources, and social organization. The Protestant Reformation fragmented Western Christian unity, but beneath theological disputes lay questions of who controlled wealth, who appointed clergy, who interpreted scripture, who made law, and who wielded ultimate authority. Religious division created new political possibilities. Rulers could now choose religious allegiances strategically, aligning with co-religionists abroad, using religious difference to justify territorial ambitions, or appealing to religious persecution to legitimize intervention in other states. Religion became a factor in international relations as significant as military power or economic strength. But religious division also created genuine communities of belief, transcending political boundaries. Protestants across Europe felt kinship despite belonging to different states. Catholics maintained loyalty to Rome alongside loyalty to their kingdoms. These transnational religious identities complicated state sovereignty, created potential fifth columns, and opened channels for influence that bypassed official diplomacy. As the sun sets on this era of religious politics, consider what it reveals about the relationship between belief and power. Religion wasn't merely used by cynical politicians. It inspired genuine conviction that moved millions. But neither was religion divorced from worldly concerns. It intertwined thoroughly with contests over wealth, authority, and independence. Faith and strategy, transcendence and calculation, devotion and advantage all mixed together inextricably. The Peace of Westphalia, in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, established principles that would shape modern politics. State sovereignty, religious tolerance within certain limits, and separation of religious from purely political matters. But these principles emerged from exhaustion as much as enlightenment, from strategic calculation as much as moral progress. Europe had fought itself to standstill over religion and concluded that managed coexistence cost less than perpetual war. Yet religious division would continue shaping politics for centuries to come, creating identities that persist today, defining conflicts that still simmer, and reminding us that how societies handle difference, religious or otherwise, remains among the most consequential strategic choices any community makes. The 18th century brought a profound challenge to religious authority, not from competing religions, but from a new way of understanding the world. The Enlightenment proclaimed that human reason, not divine revelation, should guide society. Scientists explained natural phenomena without reference to God. Philosophers questioned traditional beliefs. Economists described market forces as self-regulating systems. And then came the Industrial Revolution, transforming how people lived, worked, and thought with astonishing speed. Picture a world where most people lived as their ancestors had for centuries, farming the same land, practicing the same trades, worshipping in the same churches, accepting the same truths. Then, within a single lifetime, factories appeared, Cities exploded in size, railways connected distant regions, and new ideas spread through cheap printed materials. Everything that seemed permanent suddenly seemed changeable. Everything that seemed sacred suddenly seemed questionable. Religious institutions faced an existential crisis. For millennia, they'd provided answers to life's fundamental questions, moral frameworks for society, explanations for natural phenomena, and legitimacy for political authority. Now, alternative answers emerge from science, philosophy, and political theory. How should religion respond? Different religious traditions chose different strategies, revealing the same strategic calculations we've witnessed throughout history. Some retreated into fundamentalism, asserting traditional truths more forcefully, rejecting modern ideas, creating communities insulated from secular influence. Others embraced reform, adapting doctrine to accommodate new knowledge, modernizing practices, seeking relevance in changing times. Each approach had advantages and costs. Consider the Catholic Church's initial response to Enlightenment challenges. The Church resisted. Pope Pius IX, reigning from 1846 to 1878, issued the Syllabus of Errors in 1864, condemning liberalism, socialism, rationalism, and the idea that the Pope should reconcile with progress and modern civilization. The First Vatican Council in 1870 declared papal infallibility, that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, he cannot err. This was strategic retrenchment. If modernity threatened church authority, assert that authority more absolutely. If reason challenged faith, insist faith transcends reason. If national churches sought independence, centralize power in Rome. The Church chose clarity over compromise, tradition over adaptation. This preserved strong identity and loyal core believers, but alienated those attracted to modern ideas. Yet the Catholic Church would later adapt. The Second Vatican Council, from 1962 to 1965, represented dramatic reform, conducting Mass in local languages rather than Latin, engaging with other religions respectfully, acknowledging positive aspects of modernity, and updating church positions on numerous issues. This reversal reveals strategic flexibility. When initial resistance proved unsustainable, the Church adapted while maintaining core identity. Protestant denominations fragmented along modernization lines. Some embraced liberal theology, reinterpreting Scripture metaphorically, accepting evolutionary biology, supporting social reform, and treating biblical accounts as moral teachings rather than literal history. Others formed conservative movements, defending biblical inerrancy, rejecting evolution, and maintaining traditional moral teachings. This split persists today: mainline versus evangelical, liberal versus conservative, accommodationist versus traditionalist. Why did Protestantism split while Catholicism remained institutionally unified? Structure matters. Catholicism's hierarchical organization, with the Pope, bishops, and centralized authority, allowed coordinated response even if that response later changed. Protestantism's decentralized nature, multiple denominations, congregational autonomy, individual interpretation, enabled diverse responses but made unified strategy impossible. Different organizational structures generated different adaptive patterns. Judaism faced unique challenges. European Jews had lived in separate communities, maintaining distinct identity through religious practice and social separation. But Enlightenment brought emancipation, the possibility of citizenship, legal equality, participation in broader society. This created a dilemma: maintain separateness and traditional observance, or integrate and adopt modern ways. Reform Judaism emerged as adaptive strategy. Reformers modernized worship, conducting services partly in vernacular languages, introducing organ music, allowing men and women to sit together, and reinterpreting dietary laws and Sabbath restrictions. They emphasized Judaism's ethical teachings over ritual requirements, positioned it as compatible with modern life, and sought to make Judaism accessible to educated, assimilated Jews who found traditional practices burdensome. Orthodox Judaism chose differently, maintaining traditional practices and resisting modernization. But this wasn't mere conservatism, it was strategic differentiation. In a world where assimilation threatened Jewish identity, strict observance marked clear boundaries. Keeping kosher, observing Sabbath, maintaining traditional dress and practice, these created visible distinction, ensuring Jews remained identifiably Jewish rather than disappearing into secular society. Between these poles, conservative Judaism emerged, attempting synthesis, maintaining traditional practice while selectively accommodating modernity. This reveals a general pattern. When religious communities face pressure to change, they often split into reformist, traditionalist, and middle positions, each appealing to different believers and serving different strategic purposes. Meanwhile, in colonized regions, indigenous religions confronted Western Christian missionaries backed by imperial power and industrial technology. Missionary movements represented religious imperialism. Western churches, leveraging industrial wealth to spread faith globally while simultaneously expanding cultural influence and supporting colonial projects. Consider the strategic calculation behind missionary work. European and American churches raised enormous funds to send missionaries worldwide, establishing schools, hospitals, and churches in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This served multiple purposes. Spreading Christianity fulfilled religious obligation and demonstrated faith's vitality. Missionary reports inspired donors and justified continued funding. Mission stations facilitated colonial administration and commerce. Educated converts became intermediaries between colonial powers and local populations, but indigenous peoples weren't passive recipients. They adapted Christianity to local contexts, creating syncretic forms blending Christian and traditional elements. In Africa, independent churches emerged, combining Christian theology with African practices. In Latin America, indigenous peoples identified Christian saints with traditional deities. In the Pacific, cargo cults blended Christian apocalyptic expectations with indigenous beliefs. Religion proved remarkably flexible, absorbing new elements while maintaining continuity with tradition. Some colonized peoples used religion to resist colonialism. Hindu nationalism emerged in India partly as response to British rule and Christian missionary activity. Leaders like Swami Vivekananda proclaimed Hinduism's spiritual superiority over materialistic Western Christianity, asserting Indian identity and dignity despite political subjugation. Religion became vehicle for anti-colonial sentiment, preserving cultural identity while challenging foreign domination. Religious institutions also led social reform movements, leveraging moral authority for political change. Christian abolitionists argued slavery violated divine law, mobilizing believers to oppose it. The temperance movement against alcohol framed drinking as sin, using churches to organize political campaigns. Labor movements often had religious leadership, with clergy defending workers' rights based on religious principles of justice and human dignity. These religious social movements reveal strategic use of moral authority. Religious institutions had organizational networks, regular gatherings, moral credibility, and motivated members' resources valuable for political mobilization. Social reformers used religious language and institutions to advance causes that might have seemed merely political without religious framing. Religion provided motivation, legitimacy, and infrastructure for social change. But modernity also enabled religious innovation. New religious movements emerged, often blending traditional elements with modern ideas. Mormonism in America, Baha'i in Persia, Spiritism in Brazil all arose in the 19th century, offering new revelations, new prophets, new scriptures. These movements demonstrate religion's continuing creativity, its ability to generate novel forms, addressing contemporary concerns while claiming ancient or divine authority. The 19th century also saw religion increasingly used to mark national identity. Irish Catholicism versus English Protestantism, Polish Catholicism versus Russian Orthodoxy, Serbian Orthodoxy versus Austro-Hungarian Catholicism. Religion became shorthand for ethnicity and nationality. This wasn't new, but intensified as nationalism spread. Religious identity and national identity fused, making religious conflict inseparable from nationalist conflict. Consider the consequences of this fusion. Religious difference could justify territorial claims, ethnic cleansing, and independence movements. The breakup of the Ottoman Empire involved not just nationalism but competing religious identities. Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Turks, each defined partly by religion. The Balkans became a powder keg where Orthodox, Catholic, and Muslim communities fought for territory and sovereignty. Religion marked boundaries between groups competing for power and land. Yet modernization also produced secularization, declining religious authority in public life, reduced church attendance, and growing numbers identifying as non-religious. This trend, strongest in Western Europe, suggested religion might eventually disappear as societies modernized. But this prediction proved premature. Religion adapted, survived, and in many places thrived despite predictions of its demise. Why did religion persist? Because it continued, offering strategic advantages that secular alternatives couldn't fully replace. Religious communities provided social support networks more effective than impersonal government programs. Religious meaning-making answered existential questions secular philosophy left open. Religious identity offered belonging in increasingly anonymous urban societies. Religious morality provided frameworks for behavior when traditional social controls weakened. Religious institutions made calculated choices about how to retain members and influence. Some invested heavily in education, establishing schools and universities, ensuring future generations remained connected to faith. Others adapted worship styles, making services more emotionally engaging or intellectually stimulating. Some emphasized social services, demonstrating religion's practical value. Others stressed distinctive identity, offering clear alternatives to secular culture. These weren't random responses, they were strategic adaptations to competitive environment. Religious institutions competed with secular alternatives for members' time, money, loyalty, and commitment. Those that adapted successfully retained influence, those that failed to adapt declined. This created evolutionary pressure favoring innovations that worked while eliminating approaches that didn't. The collision between religion and modernity also forced theological innovation. How do you maintain faith when science explains phenomena religion once attributed to divine action? Religious thinkers developed various approaches. God works through natural laws rather than violating them. Religious truth addresses different questions than science. Scripture speaks in metaphor and symbol rather than literal fact. Divine mystery transcends human understanding, including scientific understanding. These theological moves weren't merely intellectual exercises. They determined whether educated believers could maintain faith. If religion required rejecting well-established science, many educated people would abandon religion. If religion could accommodate scientific findings while maintaining core spiritual claims, it remained a viable option for modern believers. The stakes were survival in increasingly educated societies. By the early 20th century, a complex religious landscape had emerged. Traditional religions had adapted, split, or resisted in various ways. New religious movements had appeared. Secularization had advanced in some regions, while religion remained vibrant in others. Missionary activity had spread Christianity globally, while indigenous religions had adapted or resisted. Religious identity had fused with national identity in some contexts while separating in others. What's remarkable is religion's resilience. Despite dramatic social, economic, and intellectual changes, religious belief and practice persisted. Adaptations varied. Some religions became more conservative, others more liberal. Some emphasized tradition, others innovation. Some retreated from public life, others engaged actively, but nearly all major religious traditions survived, and many thrived. This persistence suggests something profound. Religion addresses human needs that modernity doesn't eliminate. The need for meaning, community, ritual, transcendence, moral framework, and connection to something beyond oneself. These remain even in scientifically advanced, economically developed, politically democratic societies. Religion evolved to meet these needs in modern contexts, demonstrating the same adaptive capacity it had shown throughout history. As you contemplate this period of transformation, recognize that we're still living through religion's encounter with modernity. The tensions between traditional belief and scientific understanding, between religious authority and individual autonomy, between sacred community and secular society, these remain unresolved. Different religions, different communities, different individuals continue navigating these tensions, making strategic choices about adaptation and resistance. And the story continues evolving as new technologies, new ideas, new social arrangements challenge and inspire religious responses, ensuring that this ancient human enterprise remains dynamic, contested, and consequential in our contemporary world. Step into the present moment and observe the religious landscape surrounding us. Despite centuries of scientific advancement, despite secularization in many Western societies, despite predictions of religion's inevitable decline, over 80% of the world's population still identifies with a religious tradition. Christianity claims 2.4 billion adherents, Islam 1.9 billion, Hinduism 1.2 billion, Buddhism 500 million. These aren't relics of a fading past. These are living, evolving, strategically adapting institutions shaping billions of lives today. Why does religion persist? Because it continues offering strategic advantages that secular alternatives struggle to match. Consider the most fundamental human need: connection. In an age of unprecedented communication technology, loneliness has become epidemic. People live in cities of millions yet feel isolated, interact through screens yet crave authentic relationship. Religious communities provide what algorithms cannot: regular face-to-face gatherings, shared purpose, mutual support, genuine belonging. Walk into any thriving congregation, church, mosque, temple, synagogue, and witness the social infrastructure at work. People greet each other by name. They inquire about sick relatives. They organize meals for new parents. They provide childcare, job referrals, and emotional support. This isn't incidental to religion, it's central. Religious communities create social capital, the networks of relationships that make life navigable and meaningful. This community-building function explains why immigrants often become more religious after moving to new countries. When you're disconnected from family and familiar culture, religious institutions provide instant community. You attend services in your heritage language, eat familiar foods at religious celebrations, meet people who share your background. Religion becomes survival strategy in unfamiliar environments, providing orientation, connection, and practical assistance. But religion offers more than social connection. It provides meaning-making in a world that can seem random and purposeless. When tragedy strikes illness, death, disaster, secular frameworks often offer only platitudes. Bad things happen. Life is unfair. Move on. Religion offers narrative frameworks that make suffering comprehensible, if not acceptable. Your loved one is with God. This trial tests and strengthens you. Justice will come in the afterlife. Suffering has purpose in a cosmic drama. These aren't necessarily true claims, but they're useful ones. They help people endure hardship, find purpose in pain, and continue living when tragedy might otherwise overwhelm. The strategic value of meaning-making explains why religious belief often intensifies during crises. When the world seems chaotic, religious frameworks provide order. When life seems meaningless, religious narratives provide purpose. Religious institutions have also proven remarkably adept at leveraging modern technology and business models. Consider the megachurch phenomenon. Churches like Lakewood in Houston or Hillsong in Australia operate like corporations, sophisticated marketing, professional production values, diversified revenue streams, and carefully branded experiences. They offer state-of-the-art children's programs, dynamic worship bands, practical life advice, and vast parking lots. This isn't your grandmother's church, it's religion as contemporary entertainment and self-improvement. Critics decry this as commercialization, but it's strategic adaptation. In competitive religious marketplace where people have countless alternatives for their time and money, successful churches provide value. They make attendance convenient, worship engaging, teaching practical, and community accessible. They use business techniques because those techniques work. They attract and retain members in ways traditional approaches often fail to achieve. Islamic finance demonstrates different strategic innovation. How do you participate in modern global economy while following religious prohibitions on interest? Islamic banks developed creative solutions, profit-sharing arrangements, asset-backed financing, leasing agreements that comply with Sharia while enabling commercial transactions. Islamic finance now manages trillions of dollars, demonstrating that religious law can adapt to modern economics without abandoning core principles. Or consider the Dalai Lama's media-savvy diplomacy. Exiled from Tibet since 1959, lacking political power or territory, the 14th Dalai Lama has maintained global attention on Tibetan cause through strategic use of media, celebrity relationships, and interfaith dialogue. He frames Tibet's struggle in universal language, human rights, cultural preservation, non-violence that resonates beyond Buddhist communities. He's made Tibetan Buddhism fashionable among Western celebrities, generating sympathy and donations. This is religious leadership as sophisticated public relations. Televangelism and online ministry represent religious adaptation to communication technology. Evangelists reach millions through television and internet, building global followings without physical churches. They solicit donations through sophisticated fundraising appeals, merchandise sales, and subscription services. Some have become wealthy, controversial, and influential, demonstrating that religious authority no longer requires traditional institutional structures. A charismatic individual with camera and internet connection can build religious empire. These innovations reveal continuing competition in religious marketplace. Religious organizations compete for members, donations, influence, and relevance. They monitor attendance, track giving, measure engagement, and adjust strategies based on what works. Successful religious organizations grow, unsuccessful ones decline. This creates evolutionary pressure toward approaches that attract and retain adherents in contemporary contexts. What attracts contemporary adherents? Often, strict requirements. Counterintuitively, demanding religions often grow faster than permissive ones. Churches that require tithing, regular attendance, lifestyle restrictions, and active service grow, while liberal churches asking little decline. Why? Because costly requirements signal commitment, create strong communities, and provide clear identity. If anyone can be member without sacrifice, membership means little. If membership requires genuine commitment, it becomes valuable. This pattern appears globally. Evangelical Christianity grows in Latin America and Africa. Fundamentalist Islam, attracts young Muslims in Europe and Middle East. Orthodox Judaism retains members better than Reform. Strict Mormon requirements correlate with high retention and satisfaction. The pattern suggests that in religiously voluntary contexts, strictness is strategic. Advantage, it builds cohesion, filters lukewarm members, and creates distinctive communities. But religion's contemporary influence extends beyond personal belief. Religious mobilization remains potent political force. In the United States, evangelical Christians constitute crucial voting bloc, influencing elections and policy on issues from abortion to religious freedom. In India, Hindu nationalism shapes government policy and social tensions. In Iran, clerical authority directs state power. In Israel, ultra-Orthodox parties leverage parliamentary systems to gain disproportionate influence. Religion remains entwined with politics, just as it has throughout history. Religious identity also marks contemporary conflicts, though rarely as simple cause. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict involves competing national claims, but Jewish and Muslim identities make compromise harder and mobilization easier. Violence in Myanmar against Rohingya Muslims involves ethnic persecution, but religious difference marks boundary between groups. Terrorism, by groups claiming Islamic justification, involves political grievances, but religious framing motivates recruits and justifies violence. Religion doesn't cause these conflicts alone, but it shapes how they unfold and how difficult they are to resolve. Yet religious cooperation also occurs when strategically advantageous. Interfaith dialogue brings together leaders from different traditions, building relationships and reducing tension. Shared social services, food banks, homeless shelters, disaster relief find Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others working together. Political alliances form across religious lines. When shared interests align, conservative Christians and Orthodox Jews cooperating on religious freedom issues, progressive religious communities joining social justice campaigns. These cooperative efforts reveal pragmatic calculation alongside principle. Religious leaders recognize that in pluralistic societies, cooperation advances shared interests better than conflict. Building relationships with other religious communities provides protection, influence, and access to resources. Interfaith work generates positive publicity and demonstrates relevance. Even when theological differences remain unbridgeable, practical cooperation makes strategic sense. The digital age has created new religious possibilities and challenges. Online religious communities form around shared beliefs or identities, transcending geography. People access religious teachings through podcasts, apps, and streaming services. Religious arguments and apologetics fill social media. Young people encounter diverse religious ideas earlier and more extensively than any previous generation. This creates both opportunity reaching global audiences and risk losing members to alternative beliefs easily accessible online. Religious institutions respond variously to digital disruption. Some embrace technology enthusiastically, streaming services, creating apps, engaging on social media, and building online communities. Others resist, viewing digital interaction as inadequate substitute for physical presence. Some find synthesis, using digital tools to supplement rather than replace traditional practices. As with previous technological disruptions, different strategic choices generate different outcomes. Secularization continues in Western Europe, where church attendance declines, religious affiliation drops, and secular worldviews spread. But globally, religion remains vibrant. Africa and Latin America show high religious engagement. The United States, despite development, maintains high religiosity compared to similar nations. Asia sees diverse patterns: declining religion in some contexts, religious revival in others. The predicted global secularization hasn't materialized uniformly. Why does secularization vary so much? Context matters enormously. Where states provide robust social services, religion's practical advantages diminish. Where societies feel culturally threatened, religious identity intensifies. Where religious institutions maintain vitality and relevance, attendance persists. Where alternative meaning-making frameworks flourish, religious belief weakens. Secularization isn't inevitable. It's contingent on specific social, political, and institutional factors. Religion also adapts by addressing contemporary concerns. Environmental stewardship becomes religious obligation. Interfaith marriage gets theological accommodation. LGBTQ inclusion divides but also inspires religious innovation. Mental health awareness integrates with spiritual practice. Racial justice becomes religious imperative. Religion doesn't just preserve ancient wisdom, it interprets that wisdom for contemporary challenges, maintaining relevance by addressing issues believers care about. This adaptive capacity ensures religion's persistence. The problems religion addresses need for meaning, community, moral framework, identity, purpose, comfort in suffering remain constant even as society changes. Religious institutions that effectively address these needs in contemporary contexts thrive. Those that fail to adapt decline. But overall, religion persists because human needs it addresses persist. Consider what this reveals about religion's nature. It's not static tradition passively inherited. It's dynamic enterprise, constantly adapting to changing circumstances. It's not separate from strategic calculation. It's thoroughly enmeshed with practical considerations about resources, members, influence, and survival. It's not declining vestige of pre-modern thought. It's evolving response to enduring human needs, using contemporary tools and addressing contemporary concerns. As you contemplate religion's present position, recognize that we're witnessing the same patterns we've traced throughout history: competition for followers, strategic adaptation to circumstances, innovation in response to challenges, use of available technologies, and intertwining of belief with practical concerns about organization, resources, and influence. Religious leaders today make strategic calculations just as Mesopotamian priests, Roman emperors, and Reformation theologians did. They assess what attracts members, what retains loyalty, what generates resources, what builds influence. They adopt techniques that work and abandon approaches that fail. They compete with other religious organizations and secular alternatives for members' commitment. Yet genuine belief coexists with strategic behavior. The same religious leader can sincerely believe divine truth and strategically manage organizational finances. The same believer can experience transcendent meaning and pragmatically value community benefits. Faith and calculation aren't opposites. They intertwine throughout religious history and in contemporary religious life. Religion persists in the 21st century for the same reason it emerged in ancient Mesopotamia. It solves human problems. It creates community among strangers. It provides meaning when life seems purposeless. It coordinates collective action. It marks identity boundaries. It offers comfort in suffering. It legitimizes authority. It motivates sacrifice. These functions remain valuable, making religion unlikely to disappear regardless of technological advancement or social change. As you drift towards sleep, consider this final thought. Religion represents humanity's longest-running social technology, continuously evolving for thousands of years, adapting to countless contexts, surviving repeated predictions of its demise. It persists not through inertia, but through constant innovation, not despite modernity, but by engaging it, not as ancient relic, but as living enterprise addressing enduring human needs in ever-changing circumstances. The sacred and the strategic have always intertwined in religious history. They remain intertwined today, and, understanding this, seeing religion as simultaneously about transcendent truth and practical strategy, eternal wisdom and temporal adaptation, divine revelation and human organization, helps us understand why religion has shaped human civilization so profoundly and why it continues shaping our world today. The story of religion is the story of humanity, organizing itself at scale, creating meaning in vast cosmos, building communities among strangers, coordinating action across generations, and seeking something beyond the immediate and material. That story began in ancient temples. It continues in contemporary sanctuaries, digital spaces, and hearts of billions. It's far from finished.